So it's a gift from the history book. Well, welcome to the Audie Murphy portion of the museum. We have about 7 or 8 first-timers here this evening. So you're going to hear this information for the first time. The rest of you have heard it 2 or 3 times. This is the first lecture of the Roundtable since for 2025. For those of you first-timers who don't know me, my name's Ron Robinson, and I have the privilege of serving as the chairman of the board. Roundtable was founded in an effort to memorialize the efforts and sacrifices of those men and women of our nation who served in World War II and successfully defeated the forces of tyranny. Our motto, printed in your program, says it all. They fought to save our nation's freedom. The glory is theirs. The duty to tell their story is ours. And 2025 is the 80th year since the end of the war. How appropriate the overall theme for the 5 lectures of the Roundtable. For the 5 lectures the Roundtable is presenting in 2025 is Peace 1945, Peace at Last, the events that made it happen. And by the way, 2025 is the 100th anniversary of Audie Murphy's birth. The museum will celebrate that in May, where the Roundtable for Audie Days, which occurs annually here in Greenville, and they will have from 75 to 100 people from all over the United States here to celebrate Audie Days. The Roundtable will also have one of the lectures for that event, which will occur on a Saturday morning. And if you look at the schedule of lecturers that you have on your seat, you'll see the individual who is going to be speaking that afternoon, and I'll talk more about him in a moment. Actually, his name is Seth Paradon, and he formerly was the head of the oral history program at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. He personally oversaw all of the interviews with the surviving Medal of Honor winners during the 1990s and early part of this century. And he also hosts a weekly podcast called The Unauthorized History of the Pacific War. If you haven't looked at it, get up on YouTube. It is an incredible program run by 3 historians, and they do it every week. It's live podcast, I think on Tuesday morning about 9 o'clock our time. Our gold sponsor for tonight's program is the History Department of East Texas A&M. On behalf of the Roundtable, we thank the History Department and Department Chair Dr. Sharon Kowalski, whom you will hear from later, introducing Dr. Vuic. She is the head of the department chair for the Department of History and member of the board of the Roundtable. Sharon, we thank you very much for your support as the gold sponsor tonight. Gold sponsors support the direct costs of bringing our speakers to Greenville. If your company or organization has an interest in becoming a gold sponsor, please see me or our treasurer, David King, after tonight's program. Roundtable volunteers this evening include Graham Sweeney and David King, who greeted you upon arrival. We also want to welcome Derek Price, who's back in the back. His company will be doing the videotaping of all of the Roundtable lectures for 2025 under the auspices of the Greenville electric utility system. A very special thanks to JUICE for their leadership and support in making the Roundtable lectures available to all Americans. Googling World War II History Roundtable, Audie Murphy Chapter, Greenville, Texas, will lead you to all previous lectures that we've done. At the conclusion of tonight's lecture, the screen behind me will be lifted, and attendees are welcome to tour the Audie Murphy portion of the museum. Following Carrie's lecture, she will be happy to answer any of your questions. A microphone will be brought to you. Please wait until Susan Lanning brings it to you before asking the question, so the audio can be captured on the video for YouTube, and you can say to your grandkids, you can see me on a nationally distributed video about World War II. So here's your chance for fame. So wait till and you can actually give your name if you'd like. Kara's book, The Girls Next Door, Bringing the Home Front to the Front Lines, was supposed to be here this evening, but the publisher didn't get it to us in time, Kara. Now, what you can do, what we encourage you to do, you can go out to the cash register and you can buy that book this evening. We're going to get it in and we'll get the book to you. So feel free to do that, and we certainly hope that you will take advantage of that situation. By the way, if you renew or become a member of the Roundtable tonight and support the ongoing administrative costs of presenting our lectures, all books in the bookstore will be 20% off. Plus, the museum will extend a complimentary one-year individual membership to you. Included in your program this evening that you have at your chair is an evaluation of tonight's lecture, as well as evaluating the entire series for 2025. We're always interested in your views on what we can do to grow and develop the Roundtable. By the way, the Roundtable is one of about 25 World War II history roundtables nationwide, and it is the only one in Texas. Please mark your calendar for the next one, which is going to be Dr. Adam Seep. He will present the second lecture of the series entitled GIs, Germans, and the Ends of War, 1944-1946. Dr. Seep is the professor of history at Texas A&M College Station, where his major teaching field is European military history. Now, to get to the crux of why we're here this evening, would you please welcome Dr. Sharon Kowalski, who will introduce Dr. Vuic. Dr. Kowalski received her master's degree in history from the University of North Carolina. Is that the Tar Heels?
Yes.
That's the Tar Heels, okay. And her doctorate at the same university. Her historical focus is Russian history. She has been at East Texas A&M since 2006. And she has been invaluable in helping this roundtable move forward by making suggestions, by letting us meet in commerce and talk about what we're trying to do for now and the future. She's just been a great asset to this roundtable, as has been the university. So without further ado, Dr. Kowalski, would you come and introduce Dr. Vuic?
Thank you so much for that, those kind words. The History Department at East Texas A&M University is thrilled to be the gold sponsor for this event and to support the study of history in all forms in this region. And so it is now my great pleasure to introduce to you my friend, Kara Dixon Vuic. Dr. Vuic is the Benjamin W. Schmidt Professor of War, Conflict, and Society in 20th Century America at Texas Christian University, where she also teaches courses on U.S. wars and American society, gender and war and memory. Dr. Vuic is a prolific and award-winning scholar and has made significant contributions to our understanding of gender in American society during World War II. In addition to her numerous articles and book chapters, she has published 2 monographs, Officer, Nurse, Woman, the Army Nurse Corps in the Vietnam War in 2010, and more recently, The Girls Next Door, Bringing the Home Front to the Front Lines from 2019, the book that Ron mentioned that you can acquire should you choose. Both books have won numerous prizes for their contributions to military history. Dr. Vuic is also an editor of the Routledge Handbook on Gender, War, and the U.S. Military, co-editor of a collection, Managing Sex in the U.S. Military, and co-editor of Cambridge University Press's book series, Military, War, and Society in Modern American History. She is actively engaged in shaping U.S. military history. She is an appointee to the Department of the Army Historical Advisory Subcommittee, served as a trustee for the Society for Military History from 2019 to 2023, and currently serves on the advisory board to Eastern National for the Vietnam Women's Memorial. She is currently working on a new book project titled Drafting Women, and it is my pleasure to bring her to the podium to speak to you tonight.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you all for coming out. I know it's cold. A friend of mine's daughter is in Madison, Wisconsin, and a couple days ago it was negative 12. And I said it feels really bad to complain when we're a full 37 degrees, warmer than that, but it's still really cold for Texas. So thanks for coming. I've had a great time visiting. I've only ever passed through here before, and so it's been really nice to meet some great people and talk history all day long, which is my favorite thing to do. I appreciate the sort of your slogan to tell the stories, and so I want to tell some stories tonight. And the first one I want to tell is not actually about this subject, but is about my title at TCU, and I always try to tell this story wherever I go. So I'm the Lance Corporal Benjamin W. Schmidt Professor. Benjamin Schmidt was a TCU student. He was from San Antonio originally, and he came to TCU, and like a lot of young boys who go to college, he had a really good time for like 3 semesters. And then his parents were like, "You've had enough fun. We're going to try this again." And so he went home to San Antonio, and he came home one day and he told his parents, "I joined the Marine Corps," and they didn't believe him, actually. But he did. He joined the Marines and he became a scout sniper. And he was nearing the end of his 4-year enlistment and was sort of thinking about life past the Marines and was looking to come back to TCU because he had decided what he wanted to do was become a professor of military history. But before he could do that, his battalion was ordered again to Afghanistan, and because none of the snipers had been before, he volunteered to go with them. And Benjamin was killed in a friendly fire accident in October 2011. When that happened, the history department at TCU learned that the knucklehead boy who drank his way through 3 semesters left half of his life insurance policy to our department to create a fellowship for a graduate student in history. And so our top award goes to a graduate student studying any form of history, and they're the Benjamin Schmidt Fellow. And his family then created the professorship in his memory so that someone will always be at TCU teaching military history, kind of in his memory and his name. So it's an amazing story, and it's really humbling that I get to do what he wanted to do. And so I want to just always tell his story when I go somewhere. When a lot of people think about World War II and women in World War II, I think most of us probably think about, Rosie the Riveters, or women in factories, nurses. Maybe today, because of the 6888 Netflix series, we know a little bit more about other women who served. And so I'm going to tell you something that's not that. I want to talk about something a little bit different that we probably don't think about all that often. And it's sort of this broad question of how Americans in World War II thought about what women could do or should do, and specifically what the United States government could make them do during war. And so I want to start with a story as well. So one day in the early fall of 1940, Rika Schwenke, like many Americans, was listening to the radio. The world was at war. The Japanese had taken Indochina, Hitler and Mussolini were meeting to discuss their war aims, and Londoners continued to suffer under perpetual bombing. Although the United States remained technically neutral, by the fall of 1940, it was increasingly looking like the United States was going to get involved. And so on September 16, 1940, Congress passed the first peacetime draft in the nation's history, the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, which initially required all men between 21 and 35 to register with their local draft boards for potential conscription, and registration was set for 1 month later on October 16. Now, Rika wanted to do something for the war effort. She had some experience as a practical nurse and thought that she might roll bandages, drive an ambulance, something like that. And something that an announcer said on the radio this day in the fall piqued her interest. The announcer must have said something about selective service in the upcoming registration because she heard something that made her believe that she would be permitted to register. So on October 16th, she went to the registration site at the local elementary school in Austin, Minnesota, and asked to register. Now, undoubtedly, she stood out in a very long line of men that day. When it was her turn, she told the registrant, a woman named Mrs. Bessie Vandenover, that she wanted to join the Army and she wanted to be called immediately. Now, Vandenover wasn't sure that women could register, but Rika told her what she'd heard on the radio, and Vandenover signed the form. Rika Schwenke became the first, and to my knowledge, the only woman in American history who was registered for selective service, and she was assigned number 14 as her serial number. This is the article that appeared in the New York Times shortly after. We have her picture alongside an article. The placement here is really interesting to me. Alongside an article of hysterical women. So here's her this is the list in the local newspaper of all of the registrants from Mower County in Minnesota. Here is Rika Schwenke, number 14. And here's her registration card. Right, not something you see every day. I called friends when I found this. Like, you're not going to believe this. So she's listed her twin sister as her contact. She was 28 years old, her address, her signature. Here's the back with her height and her weight, which I'm sure she was absolutely thrilled that they wrote down. And Bessie Vandenover, who signed the registration form. Now, by the time the local paper had heard of her registration, Rika had learned that women were, in fact, not permitted to register for selective service, and that she had only done so because of misunderstanding. The chairman of her local draft board followed standard procedure for odd cases like this, informed the governor of the state of the unusual situation, but in the meantime, her registration remained on the books. Now, by the end of October, 16 million men and one woman had registered for selective service. And at the time, the way that conscription worked was by lottery. And so all registrants were assigned a serial number. Hers was 14, and everyone's number was between 1 and 7,836. And those were all drawn in a lottery on October 29th. And this is a video of that day. And so what happened was that each serial number was put into a little capsule. Those capsules were put into the glass bowl, which is the same glass bowl that was used in the World War I draft. The spoon is a wooden spoon taken from wood from Independence Hall in Philadelphia, because we're very big on symbolism. And Secretary of State Newton Baker, blindfolded, draws out each capsule, and that's the order in which you would be called for conscription. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to be conscripted, but that's the order in which you go for your exam to determine if you have any exemptions, deferments, right, etc. And so here goes Secretary of War Newton Baker. Newton Baker was World War I. Henry Stimson, wrong war, sorry. The historians here are going to call me out on that. And so he draws out The numbers, and while I am absolutely certain that all of the officials in Minnesota were really hoping that number 14 was going to be like the last one drawn out, hers was the 11th number to be drawn that day. And so the first 100 for Austin in the local paper again, here she is, right here, number 11. So I tell my students, I don't have a primary source to document that these officials were really hoping that she would not be drawn, but I'm pretty sure they were. Now, the local draft board chairman said to the press that she would receive the same questionnaire about her health and her circumstances that everyone received. And for her part, she said she did not want to be exempted. But the State Selective Service Board said that when she completed her questionnaire, that local officials were to classify her as 4F, which was the category that indicated one was physically, mentally, or morally unfit for service, and which carried a great stigma during the war years. Rika objected she was not unfit, and it appears that a lot of people agreed because she received fan letters from all over the nation, from mostly women praising her desire to serve and commiserating that women should be able to help in their nation's defense. So all of this begs the question, why in the world was she allowed to register? Right? The law was very clear. There was no murky law that muddied the waters here. Was Bessie Vandenover completely clueless in signing the form? Maybe. But Bessie also had sons who later registered, and so I don't know. But it's also possible that Rika really believed that she would be permitted to register. Because in the lead up to American entry into World War II, Americans from Congress to Main Street debated who should serve and in what ways, who should be liable for military service, who should be exempted from military service, and a part of that conversation always included women, and a discussion about what roles women might play and whether the nation would compel them to serve the wartime state, and if so, how. Now, all of this probably seems really surprising to us, partly because the United States has never drafted women to do anything of any sort in any war. And a very smart Alecky student once asked me, how can you write a book about something that never happened? I'm like, well, fair point. It's never happened, but we've talked about it a lot. And so what I want to do is sort of talk about how we've talked about it and what those discussions can tell us a little bit about how Americans thought of women's role. And it's particularly interesting to me that Americans very clearly talked about conscripting women to do certain things during World War II, given the very vitriolic response to the creation of women's military units, which is something I think we've also sort of forgotten, is how very much opposed most Americans were to women serving in the military in any form, unless they were nurses. There was a lot of vitriol directed against those women at that time. But World War II also brought the United States the closest that it has ever come to drafting women, and we came fairly close in early 1945. World War II shows us that the United States could accept the conscription of women if there was a demonstrated need. It would not do so on principle, which is what proponents wanted, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. But under a demonstrated need, many Americans could conceive of that. And the public, military leaders, and the executive branch were far more supportive of that idea than was Congress. Congress was always sort of far more hesitant to even talk about the issue. But what's interesting about this topic and in the midst of World War II is that it also shows how the military allowed sort of racial and gender norms to create a nurse shortage that was so great that the only solution to many Americans seemed conscription. It was a shortage that was in many ways self-inflicted. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, why am I studying this? Why am I writing the book about something that's never happened? Thanks, Sam. most of my work to date has been about what women have done and what it's meant that they've served, whether they were nurses in Vietnam or whether they were Red Cross or USO women doing work to support the military. And so now I'm sort of flipped it, and I'm looking at what has it meant that we've never asked women, never conscripted women to do any kind of service. So that's what I want to think about. What all of these debates can tell us about women's place in the nation in World War II, about the relationship between military service and citizenship, and about what citizenship has meant for different groups of people. So if we start with selective service just as a whole, I think when most Americans think about selective service, we immediately think of a draft. But selective service, which is the particular kind of a draft that the United States has chosen to use, right? There are lots of ways to draft people. Different countries have done different things. But in the United States, we used a selective service as a way to balance military, industrial, and civilian needs. So as sort of following World War I, the Brits learned very quickly, you cannot have all men rushing to the front, right? You cannot have all men rushing to join the military, because then you have nobody in the farms, in the factories, in the fields, right? You cannot have everybody just rush to join. You have to manage those needs in some ways. And so by World War II, the American government knew we can't, for example, allow all the steel workers to go rush and join the Marine Corps, because then we're not going to have steel workers, right? And so it's sort of a balance. And so how do we balance industrial needs with military needs? We can't have people jumping from one job to another all the time, because then we're spending all this time and money training people to do essential work, sort of all these things. So part of that conversation always involved women and women workers, especially as they sort of, like a year into the war, as the backlog of unemployment had basically been run through. Are we going to have women do something? Are we going to force them to do something? And in the late 30s, in 1940 and 1941, what FDR wanted was national service for everybody. Right? He wanted a national service plan where every adult American was registered and was assigned to work depending on their skills. He wasn't going to send everybody to do everything, but he wanted a national service plan. And he backed away from that at various times, but that was always a topic that kept coming back. Less than 2 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Washington Post announced that the Army and Navy Nurse Corps and the Red Cross were considering the need to draft nurses, as well as the possibility of a nurse corps that could only serve in the United States. And by that they meant sort of women who were older or married perhaps, who could not be sent overseas, but could still work as civilian nurses, sort of free a nurse to nurse, basically. In March of 42, Representative Joseph Baldwin of New York proposed a bill to register women 18 to 65 and said he didn't want to draft, but he wanted a way to provide complete information on who was available for what kinds of work. That proposal was never taken up by committee, but a Gallup poll that same month showed that the American public overwhelmingly supported it. And every Gallup poll on the question of conscripting women throughout the war always favored the idea. Right? The percentage itself varied, but it was always in favor. So the idea of national service reappears throughout the war, kind of waxing and waning in sort of in concert with wartime needs. As needs increase, people would talk about it a little bit more. But it was always part of the conversation about what wartime service meant, right? It wasn't just that we need these people, but it was about what, if they did serve in some way, what would that mean? What would the state owe them in return? So for example, when FDR proposed the voluntary registration of women for war industry work in April 42, the Director of Selective Service, Louis B. Hershey, said that doing so will provide recognition that women are considered as having an equal place with men in registering for our national war effort. Right? So Selective Service Director is saying this is about something more than just work. The following year, Congress debated the Austin-Wadsworth National Service Act, which would have registered men for military or civilian work and women for civilian work. And the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, got that right now, he wrote to FDR and said that when the very life of the nation is and civilization of which we're in part is in peril, there can be no discrimination between the men and women who are assigned by the government to its defense at the battlefield and the men and women assigned to producing the vital materials essential to successful military operations. Right? So the Secretary of War is saying this is about something larger. Now, of course, not everybody agrees with that. There's a lot of folks who believe that conscripting women for any kind of service was absolutely the worst idea they'd ever heard. And there are varying degrees of opposition. And what I find really interesting is that a lot of the opposition comes from women's groups, some of whom are sort of pacifist groups and oppose any kind of conscription on principle for any reason. But others are also women who say that women's job during wartime is in the home. It's often ironically women who have careers and are not in the home who are making this argument, but that's just par for the course. But that's the argument that's most commonly used in opposition to conscripting women, is that women's job is in the home, women's job is with the children, women should not be conscripted in any way. Now, generally speaking, nurses avoid most of the negative response, right? Because they're nurses. If you look at the history of nursing in militaries, until the mid-1800s with the Civil War or the Crimean War, most military nurses were men. After women started to enter the field, it became what most people thought of as women's work. And so by World War II, women in the Army Nurse Corps, women in the Navy Nurse Corps escaped a lot of criticism. And after the Pearl Harbor attack, you see an uptick in the number of nurses joining the Army and Navy. But even with that steady enrollment, the Army Nurse Corps never reached the number of nurses it needed. The leaders of the Nurse Corps always talked about needing more nurses. They were able to sort of get by until the Allied invasion of France in the summer of '44 kind of sparked hopes among Americans that the war was about to be over, that things were on the up and up, the war was going to end soon, and so you started to see a decline in all kinds of volunteering, people leaving factories on the home front, but also a decline in nurse enrollments. What happens in the winter of 1944? There's an exhibit over here about the Battle of the Bulge. Huge numbers of casualties, medical needs go up. The Nurse Corps is, again, short, but now massively short of nurses. And so in December 1944, a Washington Post article about Walter Lippmann, who was a famous columnist, American Women and Our Wounded Men, right down here in the bottom, beside an article on draft calls being increased. Lippmann's article shocked the public by noting that the Army was short 8,500 nurses. He said, in military hospitals at home and abroad, our men are not receiving the nursing care they must have, and with that, casualties increasing in number and in seriousness, this will mean for many of the men brought in from the battlefields that their recovery is delayed or even jeopardized. Right, there was talk of civilian hospitals being sent over without nurses being assigned. They'd start to bring in statistics and follow-up articles about the ratio of patients to nurses and how that's getting out of control. And the Surgeon General's office said that in September of '44, they had tried desperately to recruit more nurses and sent out 27,000 letters to nurses who were classified as available for military service. So meaning a registered nurse who is not deemed essential to her civilian community, right? So they don't want to pull out every nurse from Greenville, Texas, because then you might have a public health crisis, right? They're not going to pull everybody out. But 27,000 letters to nurses who were available. They got 700 replies, and of that, only 200 are eligible for commission. And that's my phone. That's my son's alarm going off for his medicine, which happens at 7:40 every night. That's classic. We had the poet laureate of the United States of America at TCU once, and my alarm went off. It gets past the don't disturb, And the other one, yeah, this is great. Yeah. It'll go off, I promise. In just a second. All right, I'm just going to get it. Okay. Sorry. If you need an alarm, it's really great because it gets through all of your don't disturbs. It's the poet laureate of the United States. I was so embarrassed. Kind of like I am now. Yes, so nurses, we really need nurses, World War II. Littman points out in his article, nurses aren't conscripted, we can't make them do this, they can make more money at home, they can be safer at home. Secretary of War reads the article and is livid. And that night, he orders his staff to start drafting a bill. Right? He is livid. They write the bill essentially over Christmas, like Christmas Eve, Christmas Day. He's got legislative workers working on a bill. And in January 45, FDR's State of the Union praises the military for its heroic efforts in the Battle of the Bulge, praises nurses, but says in his State of the Union that there is a need for 18,000 in the Army and 2,000 in the Navy. So the number Littman cited has doubled, more than doubled. And FDR says, we have to provide this care, right? It is always about the wounded soldier, right? We cannot let these wounded soldiers suffer because of it. We don't have enough nurses. 3 days later, Representative Andrew May of Kentucky introduced a bill to draft nurses in the House, and it was sent to the Committee on Military Affairs. Now, following FDR's State of the Union speech and the introduction of the bill, the number of women volunteering for the nurse corps increased. They got 2,000 nurses in 7 weeks. But even with that, it was not nearly enough, and it was going to take 9 months at that rate to meet the number that had been cited. The Surgeon General believed also that a number of those nurses had only volunteered because of the threat of the draft. He said that they had been flushed out, which I find a really interesting way of phrasing that. So they'd been flushed out, and a lot of them were saying that if a draft didn't pass, that they weren't going to volunteer. Because they assumed that if the need was so great that the nation would, in fact, draft. So the debates in Congress become really interesting because there are a lot of issues that Congress is concerned about, right? The draft shines a light on the exclusionary practices of the nurse corps that were contributing to the shortage. It didn't explain the entire shortage, but it was a big part of it. And so when the bill goes to the House committee, the committee starts to talk about these things. And it provides an opportunity for a lot of groups to say, you're creating your own problem, right? And one of the biggest discussions becomes, if we need nurses so badly, are we going to maintain segregation, right? And so everybody knows the U.S. military was segregated during the war. And though the Army denied that it discriminated against black nurses, it absolutely did. And part of the issue is that they kept trying to say they didn't discriminate. Everything we do is because of a broader social context. It's not our fault. But throughout the war, the Army Nurse Corps limited black nurses to very small numbers that they called quotas, which was essentially the max number of black nurses they would accept. Only allowed them to work with black soldiers in certain situations or with prisoners of war. By late 40, the maximum number of black nurses the Army would accept was 56. After Pearl Harbor, they said we should increase that by 50. And by early 1944, there were less than 250 black nurses in the entire Army Nurse Corps. By the end of the war, there were only 500 black women who had served. There were 59,000 nurses who served in the Army, so that's less than 1%. The Navy excluded them entirely, wouldn't even entertain the discussion until the House hearings, and basically Congress said, if you need nurses, you're going to have to take nurses, and we don't really care who they are. But these hearings provided an opportunity for black nurses who had been saying, we need to be using black nurses, we need to not discriminate, provided them an opportunity to say, this is what it's costing you. Right? And so what you start to see are articles like this one where women are saying, I'm ready to go tomorrow, I would like to go, but the Army won't take me. And so it heightens the hypocrisy of it all, and really forces the Army and the Navy to deal with the issue and to say what they're doing. The head of the National Association for Color Graduate Nurses, Mabel Stompers, was a fierce woman who was fighting this battle, and really linked it to the broader African American struggle for civil rights. And she said before Congress, we believe it doesn't make much difference to a wounded man whether it's a white, yellow, brown, or pink nurse who is helping to keep him alive. There were groups of nurses who signed petitions, and this was one of my favorite days at NARA in College Park, at the National Archives, to open a box with a massive stack of petitions of women who said, we absolutely support your bill to draft nurses, we are ready to go, but you're gonna have to end your racism, right? And so it provides an opportunity to make this case to the American public in very clear ways, right? And make the cost of segregation very, very apparent. The same kinds of issues are brought by Japanese American nurses. The Army absolutely did not want to use Japanese American nurses throughout the war, and only because of the House hearings did they finally start to say, well, if you were a citizen of Japanese ancestry, okay, but we're not going to send you abroad. And so there were similar issues of racism and racial discrimination with Japanese American nurses as well. The other group who really makes a case during this time are male nurses. From the creation of the Army Nurse Corps and the Navy Nurse Corps, they were both only open to women. And during the war, at the height of the war, the American Nurses Association estimated that there were just over 8,000 white male nurses available, and about 2,000 to 3,000 of them were practicing nurses and available. All of them were excluded from the Nurse Corps. The Army consistently resisted using male nurses and made the argument entirely about gender. When they talked about nursing, they would say that nursing is about the significant psychological effect upon the wounded soldiers from the battlefield, in addition to the technical service, and that being a woman is in itself a real asset in stimulating the hope and courage so necessary in the recovery of the sick and wounded men. Male nurses, not surprisingly, disagreed with that characterization of nursing work as essentially women's work, and had been fighting to join the Nurse Corps from the beginning of the war. Right? There are a lot of men who went to the same schools and did the same state board exams as female nurses who would rather have served as a nurse and used their skills than file papers or do whatever. And they had been pointing out from the beginning of the war that they wanted to serve, and so that the discussion of a nurse draft forced that issue. Now, when the bill passed the House, so the bill makes it out of committee and it passed the House, it did so as a bill that prohibited racial discrimination, and it would have included male nurses. And there were all sorts of very minor issues that they were still going to have to figure out, but it passed the House and went to the Senate in late March of '45. It was clear, though, that the House passed the bill only because of great need. The New York Times called it a patently reluctant decision, and a Representative Thomason of Texas said the bill would not survive 10 minutes on this floor but for the tragic present need. Right? We are only doing this because this is the only way we can get nurses. That was in March. 5 weeks later, the Soviet Army takes Berlin, and a week after that, the German military surrendered to the Allies. And when the chief of the Army Nurse Corps, who was in Europe at the time, came home, she said, now that the war in Europe is over, we don't have this great need. We can shuffle people around, send some home from Europe, send some from Europe to the Pacific. War Department informed the Senate, we don't need the bill, and it was never taken up by committee in the Senate. That's the closest the United States has ever come to drafting women. FDR had said he was going to sign it had it passed the Senate, but of course it never does. So World War II shows us that the United States could get there if there was a demonstrated need, not on principle, right? Roosevelt wanted it on principle. Others pushing for national service wanted women's registration on principle. That wasn't going to happen. But with a need for a specific group of people, Congress was almost ready to do it. The American public always supported it. The issue arises later in the 70s and essentially kind of flips around. So it comes up again next in the 70s in the debates about the Equal Rights Amendment. When Congress passed the ERA in March of 72, it not only expected, but it intended the ERA to require women's conscription, if not their service in combat. And that's a whole couple chapters that we could talk about another time. But they expected that the ERA would require women's registration and conscription. And then in 1980, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, in December 1979, Soviets invade Afghanistan. In 1980, in January, Jimmy Carter calls for registration to come back, which had ended after the Vietnam War, and he calls for women to register. Most interest groups that the administration consulted supported the idea, though combat as an assignment for women was becoming more of an issue. By the 80s, things shift again. You've got a lot of pushback against the Equal Rights Amendment, which of course never was approved by the states at the time. And so the issue of selective service in women has kind of swung back and forth, right, since then. It's still an issue today. Registering women, however, is not a pressing issue really for anybody. There's nobody like banging on congressmen's doors and like, hey, register women. Like nobody's out there doing that. And so it's hard to tell where things will go. But after the removal of restrictions on women in combat, the legal rationale for excluding them ended. And since 2013, the Department of Defense has called for women's registration, right? And think of that in the midst of all the news about recruiting crises and not meeting recruitment numbers and all of that. The Department of Defense has for more than a decade say they want women to register. It's a symbolic requirement in many ways. Some of the legal, up until a couple years ago, if an 18-year-old man did not register for selective service, he might not get federal student aid, can't get certain state jobs. Some of those sort of punishments, I guess, is probably not the right word, but some of those consequences have started to fall away. But what I find interesting as a historian of women and as a historian of the United States military is that across the history of women in the United States, even as women's political, legal, economic, social status has radically expanded, and even as you look at the history of women in the military, women have done everything now, there's still one difference between the obligations of men and women as citizens in this country, and it's that men register and women do not. And so I think it's a really interesting question that we still don't, I guess, know the answer to, or that we're still debating and figuring out, is what do women owe the state and what does the state owe women, and then who gets to decide? Who gets to decide the answers to those questions? So I don't have those answers, but I can talk about the debates. So thanks for listening. Hopefully we'll have some questions and I'll get to hear more about your mothers and sisters and aunts who served in World War II. Thanks.
Thank you very much. 4F, I had not heard that term. Larry, what would we have paid for a 4F? Baby, that would have gotten, and I joined before the lottery and I hit number 195 when the lottery came out and I was free. But they wouldn't let me out of my contract. That's the way it goes. Thank you for the podium, Ron. This is great. Appreciate it. Who has a question? Susan? Somebody's got to say, what do you want? You got one, don't you? One right here. I got 4 or 5.
It's not really fair that the historian asks the historian the first question, but I'll step up and get things started. As you know, I am a historian of the Soviet Union, and women had a very prominent role in Soviet military, especially in World War II. So I'm wondering, the U.S. knew what women were doing in other countries like the Soviet Union and like Great Britain. Was that part of the debate about what women's roles should be in the United States?
Yes. Though it's interesting that the model they preferred was Britain and not the Soviet Union. Right. They did not want women flying planes like in the Soviet Union. But the congressmen who introduced some of these bills had studied what had gone on in Britain, and many of them had even been to Britain, and were really thinking about sort of the ways in which they might need women both in the military and in factories. And so that was sort of their model. He's going to start calling on you if you don't come up with
Touching
questions.
your ear and everybody waves at you. What role did Eleanor Roosevelt have in this?
That's a good question. Yeah. Women's groups all ran to Eleanor Roosevelt if they wanted support. And she said, she sort of agreed with her husband in that she thought women should be registered, but she was always very careful to say, I don't think we should be registering women for military service. I think we should be registering them for civilian service, right? So don't stick them in airplanes like they're doing in the Soviet Union. But that was her opinion. Yeah, she wanted registration for women.
Yeah, I asked this question this afternoon. What about Germany? Did they have any kind of draft or any kind of draft proposal for women?
So no, I'm gonna rely on Sharon for this one because she knows way more about this. But basically, the German state wanted women in homes, right? What is Kinder something? What she said, yes. But they wanted women in homes having babies in Germany until things got so desperate at the end that they were willing to have women do other work. But their model was women have babies. Yeah.
If the war had dragged on, do they think it would have passed the Senate?
Probably so. The Senate was less, the Senate had more FDR opposition than the House did. They had a couple of senators who were just, anything FDR proposed was the worst thing in the world. But had the war gone on and the need for nurses continued to that degree, I think the Senate would have passed it. Yeah, not been happy about it, but yeah, I think they would have.
Could they not foresee that war was about to end and they would not actually need to register the women?
There was a lot of hope that the war would end. I think from the Army's perspective, and the Army Surgeon General, they didn't know that at the time. And they get into these big debates about sort of the status of casualties, and even if the war was going to end, they expected that the war's end would lead to more folks being needed to be sent back to the United States. The nursing need was going to increase in one place but not another. They get into some real weeds on those numbers, but essentially they thought that they were still going to need it even if the war did end.
Today, what percentage of the eligible male people in the United States are registered with the Selective Service?
So all men at 18 have to register, whether they're eligible or not, right? So they all have to register, whether ultimately the military would want them or not.
Well, what percentage has actually registered as well?
How many have done that? I think the percentage of those who don't are fairly low, in part because in a lot of states, when you get your driver's license or you register to vote, it's sort of rolled into that process. Some states have tried to separate them as a way to provide some men an opportunity not to register if they don't want to. But I don't know that number. That's a good question, but it's still fairly low of those who don't. Yeah.
I was a bit surprised that the Senate relented in April and May of 45 was saying the pressure for nursing was relieved because there were 50,000 casualties on Okinawa, which started in the 1st of April of 45. My father-in-law was practicing amphibious assaults in August of 45 with the intention of landing on the Japanese mainland. And they were projecting 1.5 million casualties. So I wonder if some other factor other than this supposed lack of need propelled the Senate to dig in their heels.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it's the Secretary of War who ends it when the Chief of the Army Nurse Corps says end it. And there's a lot of, we get sort of talking about weeds, there's a lot of sort of backstory and personality conflict between the Secretary of War and the Surgeon General, and yeah, it's amazing the way some of this stuff like plays out in politics on a national scale. But once the Chief of the Army Nurse Corps said we don't need it, Secretary of War said we don't need it, it was done. Yeah, it's kind of, the people end up making a huge difference. One person can have a huge impact. Yeah.
Somebody in Washington DC was pretty relieved when the bomb was dropped and they didn't have to worry about 1 million people being hurt.
Dr. Vuic, I've been reading a book called Target Hiroshima. It's about Deke Parsons, really, who was the #2 for Oppenheimer and helped design the actual bomb. And in that book, it says that as the B-29s were being developed, they had enormous problems with them. They were training flight crews at the same time. They were trying to get the bugs out of the B-29. And several of those flight crews, several of them were going to be captains, almost refused to fly until they got something fixed. Now the story, that's a background for the question. Did Paul Tibbets or Curtis LeMay with the B-29s, is it really true that one of them said, we're going to go find some of the women pilots, we're going to bring them out here, and they're going to fly the B-29s. And if you men don't want to fly after following these women, we'll do something else with you. Now, is that a true story?
Yes.
It is?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, tell us about it.
So they brought in some women who were in the WASP, right? The sort of Women's Armed Services pilots, and the story is that they put a female pilot and she lands the plane, and the men watch the plane land, and then she gets out. And basically it's to shame them, which is probably not what the women flying the plane would have appreciated. Like, you can fly the plane, like, you don't need to shame somebody because I can fly. Like, it's not shameful that you can't, you know what I mean? Like, they probably had a very different opinion about that. But yeah, they did do that. Yeah.
Well, who did it? Was it Tibbets or was it LeMay?
Oh, I couldn't tell you that. I know the story's true.
Probably was LeMay, but anyway. Okay, very
Yeah,
good.
they did do that.
Tell us about the outcome after the peace was signed and the women who had gone into the Rosie River and taken the men's place while they were at war, and the discrimination that occurred when the men came home. You fired the women from their civilian jobs, and especially in the defense industry, and replaced them with the men.
Yeah.
Many of whom had not had that job before the war. So they weren't just part-time used because of the absence of men. There were men who wanted those jobs. But anyway, I haven't studied the history of that, but you may have.
Yeah, I mean, women go into factories and all sorts of work when the opportunity arises in World War II. And most of them work because they need to work, right? They need the money. And so when the war comes, some of them may want to go home, but a lot of them can't. And a lot of them, and in most polling, most of the women want to stay and have these jobs because these, especially in industry, they're good paying jobs. A lot of them are union jobs. These are not the kinds of jobs that women often got. But the GI Bill, the Selective Training Service Act, guaranteed men their jobs when they came home. A lot of these women are shoved out of those higher paying, more secure, better jobs so that returning soldiers can get those jobs. But what we find is that very soon after the war, I think it's within 2 or 3 years, there are more women working than ever worked during the war, right? So sort of the myth is that all the women are pushed out and they all go back home and they all stay home. And that's not really true. There are more women working very quickly after the war, but they're working in what became known as pink sector jobs, right? They're doing less paid, less secure, you know, those kinds of jobs. So there are more women working, but they're getting paid less money. And they're still working because they need to, right? It's very soon after the war, you've got development of suburbs and all sorts of things, and the 2-income home becomes the standard. So, yeah. So they're forced out, but into lower paying jobs.
My mother was one of them.
Yeah.
Mine too.
And I also wanted to say, we did order your book. We didn't make it in time for tonight. So it's the one,
The Girls
Bring-
Next Door.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so if anybody's interested in purchasing it, it's $29.95. And we can call you next week when they're in, and you can either pick it up or we can ship it to you if you live further away. So I wanted to make sure I pointed that out. We were trying to get it here in time, but this is one that they had to, I guess they bind them as you order, and so even though I ordered a month ago, they still were not. We're not here yet.
You should have
so-
drafted them.
Yes. But I wanted to make sure to point that out.
John, my mother came home and worked for my dad, free of charge. I couldn't have done it without her too. You want to say one quick thing about 6888?
Oh, yes. So if you haven't seen 6888 on Netflix, you should watch it. I'm not paid to endorse it, but the more movies we have about women, the better. This is a big budget film. These were an amazing group of women. They get the story pretty good. You know, we mentioned segregation, so all these women joining the Army, African American women are segregated, and the Army did not want to send them abroad until all of a sudden we need them. And they sent a group of women abroad, and they did some amazing things.
What did they do?
So they were Central Postal Battalion, which may not sound like a great wartime story, except when you have millions and millions and millions and millions of letters and information backlogged and nobody can break it. And so they send these women over and they organize the mail, and mail goes through, and all of a sudden families at home are receiving news of their loved ones, and their loved ones at war are getting news from home, and they have to fight segregation and discrimination in the Army to do it, and they do it, and there's some amazing women. 3 of them, those women died in a Jeep accident, are buried at the Normandy Cemetery in Normandy, France. So if you're over there, you can go visit them. But
Yeah, and I think they did, I just watched it last weekend, and they did, I believe, over 70 million pieces of mail in 3 months.
And the men couldn't do it,
amazing.
but the women were able, they gave them 6 months to do it. They did it in like 60 days or something like that, 90 days maybe.
Any more? Charles?
How do the donut dollies fit into the situation?
Were you in Vietnam?
Yeah.
So he asked about donut dollies, which is, if anyone else is a Vietnam vet, they might know about donut dollies. This was a program that started in World War I. I know I don't have an hour to give you the whole history, but it's a program that started in World War I and continues through actually very recent wars, in which the U.S. military would send civilian women from home abroad to entertain troops at war. And so if you think of like USO programs or Red Cross programs in World War II, that's probably your more famous example, but they're still going by the Vietnam War. And they would often work sort of recreation centers where you could come get coffee and Kool-Aid if it was too hot, or donuts, or go for a Halloween party. But they also choppered women in 2 at a time to landing zones and fire bases all over Vietnam, which sounded like a good idea at the time, maybe. But you've got, yeah, I mean, it's young girls graduated from colleges all over America who volunteered to go for a year and talk to lonely boys from home. And so it's a really interesting program. The way it evolves is kind of fascinating. But I did get to interview a lot of women who'd been to Vietnam and really admire them. So.
Is that where you met your wife, Charles?
Yeah, she was over there. No, but
There were some of those who did, actually. Not many, but yeah.
Anything else? Oh, we got one more.
With the bill that was going to be in the Senate, were there any benefits for the women once they were released from the military? Like
Yeah.
education?
So, yeah, good question. If they were in the military, they were entitled to the GI Bill the same as men were. And so that's part of the motivation, especially once the GI Bill passed. Now, that you are entitled to the full benefits of the GI Bill does not mean you can actually use the GI Bill as a woman. A lot of women had trouble for all sorts of reasons, like you just talked about mothers coming home, and education was harder, but also women, the GI Bill gave you home loans, right? Guaranteed government home loans. Women can't buy homes in their own name for decades after. And so you're entitled to the benefits of it. It doesn't mean you're getting it exactly, but if any woman in the military was entitled to the GI Bill. No. Great question.
You. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
If you want your picture taken,